Give me the Bible, star of gladness gleaming, to cheer the wanderer lone and tempest tossed. No storms can hide that radiance peaceful beaming, since Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Long with the Ruston Church of Christ. I am so thankful that you're joining us right now, that you decided to click on this video. What we've been studying about in our Bible classes is a little bit about the book of Joshua and about the Israelite people as they are conquering Canaan. And we have gotten to the 13th chapter of Joshua. And if you've been following along with us, we've been maybe knocking out 2 or 3 chapters at a time. But we're going to cover chapters 13 to 21 right now. And it's all about how Joshua was following the command of God to divide the land up among the nations. And we just want to look at a couple little things out of here. It's a lot of material, but there's a lot of rich information that's there. Even though if you were to try to read this whole thing in one taking, it might put you to sleep. There's a lot of names, there's a lot of markers, a lot of borders that are being marked out, and it can get pretty dry. It can get pretty boring for you and I. But what's really, really important to keep in mind is that the reason it was written this way is because these were real events that happened to God's people, and they were keeping a history record, they were keeping a legal record, and this was important to these people because it was a fulfillment of God's promises that he originally made to Abraham and that he gave to the subsequent patriarchs from then, and then it's being fulfilled in the day of Joshua as the Israelite people have conquered Canaan. And so in chapters 13 through 21, that's what ends up happening there. And you start in chapter 13, and the process begins. They start talking about what happens as they're dividing up the land. And one of the things you notice is that every time they're dividing the land, what they're doing is they're casting lots. And there's a little bit of mystery behind what it means to cast lots, but essentially what it was is that they would have some forms of tokens like we would use dice, and they would cast them out, and then they would interpret them. It's very similar to pulling straws or rolling dice or whatever similar thing. It's almost like you're leaving it to chance. But for the Israelite people, they were doing this and they were allowing God to be in control. And so they were casting lots in order to divide the land, and the land is divided. A few things that we note that happen here. The very first thing that happens, chapter 13 starts describing a little bit of the process of the dividing of the land and where some of the borders are going to be. But in chapter 14, starting at around verse 6, this is really a reiterating what happened before they got started dividing all the land. And it's Caleb, the same Caleb that was the other spy that went with Joshua into the land of Canaan 40 years before they ever entered it to conquer. Whenever he went in as one of the 12 spies under Moses. And Caleb and Joshua were the 2 that came back and said that they could conquer the land because God was with them. Well, Caleb is one of the only 2 people from that generation still alive. And he comes up to Joshua in verse 6 and says, "You know the word which the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea." And he's reminding him of the promise, and he continues on and he tells them that he wholly followed the Lord in verse 8. And then in verse 9 again, "Because you have wholly followed the Lord my God." And he receives his own promise. And what's really neat about Caleb is that you read about his origins back in Genesis chapter 15. And he was a Kenizzite. And a Kenizzite were one of the original inhabitants of Canaan during the time that Abraham was there and when Isaac was there. And you think about what that means is that one of the only 2 people from the original generation of the Israelites from the wilderness that made it into Canaan, one of them was a Canaanite that had proselytized into the Jewish nation. That meant he converted to be one of God's people. And so he went from a Kenizzite that was set for destruction, and he becomes this recipient of a great blessing to be one of only 2 people that makes it into the nation. And then the nation of Israel and the tribes are given their inheritances, and there's a lot that we could look at there, but we'll just suffice it to say that most of them got a portion, but Judah got a double portion. Judah was blessed and received the double portion that was supposed to go to Reuben, but Reuben sinned because he tried to usurp his father's authority and sleep with Zilpah, with his handmaid, and so he receives almost no blessing, and Judah receives a double blessing. And then we read about in chapter 21 the Levites, who were the priests, the people that carried the ark, the people that worshiped in the temple. The Levites received no specific territory, but instead they received cities all throughout the land for them to dwell in. And so this land is divided, but all throughout the dividing of this land in chapter 13 and chapter 15, 16, and 17, this reminder is there that their lots are cast and they send them out to go and conquer the land. Because although as a nation whole it was conquered, not every single enemy had been driven out. And so their job was, you go, the Lord has given this land into your hand, you go and drive the rest out, and do not marry, do not intermingle, and do not take their gods. But in chapter 13, verse 13, chapter 15, 63, 16, 10, 17, 12, all these reminders, they did not drive them out. They did not drive out. They did not utterly destroy them. And that's ultimately was going to lead to Israelites' downfall. As if they hadn't learned the lesson as they were going in, and in the initial conquering, every time they did wrong, they would fail. And every time they followed God's instruction, they would succeed. But they failed as individual tribes to drive out all of the Canaanites. But the thing that I really want to zoom in on, if you will, is what occurs in Joshua chapter 20, in the first 9 verses. And what this is these are what are called cities of refuge. These cities of refuge are set up. And God had originally instructed Moses to do this. And so this is Joshua fulfilling what God had commanded Moses to do in Numbers chapter 35. And these cities of refuge are similar. You know, we have cities of refuge in the United States. And it's a similar idea to that. This is a place where people could go and their safety could be guaranteed. Now, it's not quite the blind eye acceptance of anyone, no matter of whether or not they've committed a crime or not. But there are 6 cities that were put up, and there were 3 to the west of the Jordan, and there were 3 to the east of the Jordan. And if you look at how each one of these refuge cities are spread out, there was not a single city that was more than 1 day's journey from anywhere in the kingdom of Israel. Wherever you were at within the nation, you could in 1 day travel and make it to a refuge city. And what the instructions were given was that a refuge city was a place that either a stranger, a non-Israelite could come, and when they were traveling through, they could stay in these cities and they would be guaranteed protection. Or if something had happened, if there was an accident or an incident where a life was taken, and let's say that something happened and you accidentally killed your neighbor while you were helping them build a fence, okay, and you are worried about his family retaliating against you and killing you, you could leave and you could go to the city, and the instructions were given that you would plead from outside of the gate. You would tell them what happened. Then they would bring you inside the city, the elders of that city, and they would have to protect you until a trial could be had in order to prove innocence or guilt. And then once that trial happened, you would either be convicted of guilty and punished, or you would be sent back home and the other person was charged not to harm you. And so these cities provided a place of salvation. They provided a place of protection, but ultimately their goal was to serve as a place of justice to God's law to be sought out. And I'm going to tell you the 6 cities. They are Kedesh, which was in Galilee. There was Shechem, that was in the hill countries where the tribe of Ephraim was. There's Hebron, which was in the eastern territory of Judah, which still to the west of the Jordan, but to the eastern side of what we would traditionally call the Israel nation. But then you remember there were tribes on the other side of the Jordan, on the east of the Jordan. And there were 3 cities that were set up there. There was Bezer, or Bezer, which was in the territory of Reuben. There was Ramoth, which is in Gilead, which is in the territories of Gad. And then there was Golan in Bashan, which was in the territory of Manasseh. And so there were six, three on either side, where these cities were located, where you could find security, where you could be saved from your enemies, and where ultimately justice would be found. But what's so interesting is whenever you look at the names, Kadesh, if you break it down to the original language, what it means, Kadesh means righteousness. And Shechem means a shoulder. Hebron means friendship or love. Bezer means security. Ramoth means heights. And Golan means a circle, which is to represent eternality or an everlasting and never-ending thing. So each one of these cities, each one of these refuge cities has some symbolism to it. And ultimately, I think it symbolizes Christ. You know, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 30, Christ is our righteousness. He bears our sin and bears us on his shoulders, Luke 15:4. He grants us friendship and love, 1 John chapter 1 and verse 3. He provides security for us, Psalm chapter 91. He takes us to everlasting heights, John chapter 10 and verse 28. And so we see that each one of these cities has a name that represents some attribute about Jesus Christ. And so when we look at the picture, we know the Old Testament was our schoolmaster, and God orchestrated these things in a way so that we could ultimately find the fulfillment of these things in Christ. And so when we think about these people would go somewhere where they could go for security, where they could go for safety, but ultimately for justice, it's the same thing that Jesus Christ does for us. We go to him for salvation. We go to him to save ourselves from what we can't do of our own will. And then ultimately, whoever goes to him is going to be received in justice. We can't go to him as a sinful being that never stops sinning and be accepted. Ultimately, we'll be rejected from him. But if you're familiar with Bible things and you're familiar with numerology in the Bible, you're probably wondering, well, that's 6 cities. That doesn't make sense that that's a thing of God if there's only 6. 6 is an incomplete. 6 is a thing of the world. 6 is something that's temporal or of Satan even. Well, I think that was probably on purpose as well, because there is a 7th city that's described. It's described all throughout the book of Revelation, and especially in the book, or in the chapter 21, that it is a city, and it said there is a city there where there is no temple, for God is the temple, and he dwells with his people. You know, I said at the beginning of this, these are boring chapters. They'll put you to sleep. They may, but only if we're not careful. There is rich theology that is ingrained in the Old Testament. And the more we look, the more we can find Christ. The more we can find the eternal plan that God had from the beginning of time to bring Christ in. And we see it laced, especially in this story. I hope this was useful to you. I hope it was that it maybe piqued your interest to study some of these older things out of the Old Testament that we can look at. We can draw closer to the Savior of this world. Again, we thank you so much for joining with us. If you like what we're doing, give us a like, a subscribe. You could share this video, comment, ask us questions. We'd love to hear from you. But until then, until the next time, we will see you later.